Okay, well, very good evening to you. I'd like to thank the ITC and, of course, UCL, Centre for Transport Studies here, for giving me this opportunity to begin to talk about the issue of the issues that currently face the alignment of housing and transport and how this might, just might, be better done. I'm sure lots of you have better ideas than I'm about to come forward with, so there'll be time at the end, I'm sure, to discuss those. Now, just to take these two issues separately to do the very thing that this evening is supposed to stop, they are separately, of course, essential to the economy, to individuals' lives, better or worse life, depending on your transport, get around to and from work, leisure, and similarly where you live. Enormously important to individuals' economic and social well-being. In the UK, both these systems, they have this in common, are run as a mixed economy. A very obvious mixed economy with some direct public provision, some regulated private provision, and some wholly private provision. In fact, nothing's wholly private because it's regulated by the planning system and in other ways. So for public provision, you've got council-owned council housing. There's still a certain amount of that. London Underground is run directly in that way. Regulated private provision includes housing associations or Hull Trains, I suppose, would fall in that category. And wholly private would be market-provided housing. That's most housing in the United Kingdom, subject to planning systems and controls, of course, private cars and commercial vehicles, though they, of course, are also working within, they're working on public infrastructure and within laws and rules set by the state. But crucially, for the purposes of this evening, these are separate policy spheres which have media and public commentariat type and indeed academic interest which tend to focus on one or the other, but not entirely, never both, and I'll come on to some of that, but generally and separately, and Melanie made that point already. Now, I'm not going to mention Brexit much tonight, but I can't avoid it with the next thing, because what I've done, just to try to make the point, is to look at Mori, the pollsters, publish a monthly, unprompted, what matters in Britain question. So they ask people, usual opinion poll stuff, the question is, what do you see as the most important issue facing Britain today? It's an unprompted question. They've done it every month since the 1970s. So it gives you a time frame and an answer which people themselves volunteered, no prompting. So there we are at the top. 66, this isn't, by the way, votes in the Conservative leadership contest, though similar kind of distribution, actually. So 66% there for Europe and common market and all of that, followed by the NHS, followed by crime, law and order, education and schools. You can see, and this is very important, because politicians see this and they respond accordingly. Housing appears on this with 19%, but I'm sorry to say, and I realise that I'm talking to an audience that's very interested in transport, housing isn't. So here are the breakout tables from which that chart is taken. There's housing, and right the way down you find here transport, which I'm afraid clocked 4%, okay? But they are separately seen by the public, and therefore, and I'll come on to this, also viewed in the same way by public policy. So I didn't want to depress everybody here who's interested in transport, but it is worth knowing this. And the reason it's important is not only that they are thought of separately, but it gives you a sense of what's likely to preoccupy politicians. And it works like this, and that's how, when we come to a spending review, ministers will think. So we all need to be real about this. I'm sure everybody in the room is, but it is important. Now, what the two sectors have in common, of course, is that both rely extensively on similar professional networks: engineering, architecture, design, construction, to name but four spheres of public endeavour, many of which are studied at this university. However, housing and transport have separate government machinery. Melanie's just made this point. And worse than that, all public expenditure planning, which is forced in a spending review, forces each department to bid to the Treasury for their money for the next 4, this time 1, years, makes that process even more compressed. And so when departments get the money, it's theirs, and they then spend it on their priorities, which is not to say there aren't good officials in departments who won't try to align, and Melanie made that point earlier, but the truth is, when the money is won by the department in the spending round, it's very much their money. So we've got a near total separation of government policy and machinery, at both levels, by the way, I'll come on to that. And of course, there are parts of government and the government machine or independent agencies that do seek to encourage consistent policy and analysis. The Cabinet Office in number 10, when he was Chancellor, Gordon Brown as Chancellor at the Treasury. National Infrastructure Commission, famously, of course, set up really in some ways precisely for this kind of reason, not just to make the case for infrastructure expenditure over time, but also for the rational interlinking of different kinds of infrastructure, and then think tanks, industry, and universities. Whitehall has separate departments for transport and transport and housing, as we've just heard, except with on rare occasions. Local government similarly tends to run these 2 professional areas from different departments. So here is an excellent chart produced by the Institute for Government. If you don't read their materials, they're just brilliant at this stuff. What you find out, oddly, is that the Ministry of Defence and the Home Office, this is a chart that goes from 75 to 2015, machinery of government changes don't affect these departments like the Treasury and the Home Office and Inland Revenue, though it did take over customs and excise. But the further down you come, you see all sorts of responsibilities being passed backwards and forwards. And here in this little circled area is the period that Melanie mentioned in the early years of the Labour government after 1997, when the massive Department of Environment, Transport and the Regions was bolted together until actually it fell apart, I think, as they often do, because there was a need to find another space in the cabinet for somebody who needed a place. And for those of you in the room with a long memory, and I know there are some with very long memories, the Heath government did this as well. Actually, the Department of the Environment in the early years of the Heath government did something very similar. Here's the public expenditure outcomes. This is from the Treasury's document, and all I'll say is there is a line for transport and a line for housing. And whilst I'm sure good ministers and civil servants in both departments hanker to spend housing money and transport money on housing, I just know the pressures are going to be more and more to build housing or to use the money for transport. Of course, as I'm going to explain, they are linked. We all know they are linked, but this is the way we do our financial planning as well. And it's not just central government, and I haven't chosen on Birmingham for any reason than they had a nice layout of this. So here's the senior management of Birmingham City Council. Nice pictures, everybody looks happy. There's housing and there's transport. And then within those divisions, there are individuals who do housing and transport. So it's not just that they're separate further down as well. We're in Camden here. So there's Camden. Now, in fact, David Joyce is at the top of both. Same person, who is called the Interim Executive Director Supporting Communities. You wouldn't guess from the title, but that's what his job includes. But when you get into the quite large series of responsibilities that come within that title, transport and housing, there's a lot of housing over there, and here's transport in a box there. Now, you get the point. These things matter. They're organograms, but they do matter in explaining the way council, Whitehall thinking is likely to function. And there are separate think tanks and lobby groups. Here's the ITC's excellent website, picture of a bus and things, and there's the Chartered Institute for Housing. It's not a precise analogue and parallel, but the same sort of first cousin type organisation. And of course, although in fairness to the ITC, the annual lecture is linking them together. Well done. There's not much on the Chartered Institute, not having a go at them, but they're not looking at transport at the moment. Elsewhere, there are, however, in the world of sort of think tanks, companies and indeed the National Infrastructure Commission, reports with encouraging titles like Transport and Housing for Thriving City Regions, an ARAT report there, a KPMG report here, attempting to bring them together. Now, I know that it's simplistic. It's not only these organisations that do it, and that within Whitehall and within local authorities, particularly as I'll come on to say in a moment, in some of the new combined and mayoral combined authorities, they're brought together more increasingly. But you can see how this sort of, it's not just at the government level, it's also within the world of professional activity as well. Oh, it's ahead of myself. Now, we know transport infrastructure improvements unlock housing development and can unlock massive housing development. Crossrail, there's an analysis of Crossrail. The dark blue bars here, that's the whole of the line, West London, Central London, East London. These are very large, this is measured in floor space, but very substantial numbers of homes are being created by Crossrail. And if you look at it at the individual neighbourhood level, at places such as Canary Wharf and Stratford, where massive infrastructure investments, transport infrastructure investments have been made, surprise, surprise, you can build large amounts of extra residential property, and at Canary Wharf, huge amounts of office property besides. We know this is obvious, but here is some evidence from an actual soon-to-be-opened line. And in the news, and the great thing about the combined authorities and mayoral combined authorities is that they're producing spatial plans, rather like the London plan. So this is the Greater Manchester plan. Here are the housing targets for Greater Manchester, and some text above there explaining how the improvement of public transport in Greater Manchester is going to unlock the capacity to build this housing. And of course, transport allows, especially with conventional modern planning policy, denser, more environmentally sustainable development. And there's no question that one of the things the UK has been relatively poor at is not so much in London, but in other cities, transport within cities, which could unlock enormous land for housing developments, thus reducing the need for sprawl. Lots of land in older industrial cities that can still, including in London, by the way, that can still be used. And transport infrastructure is often the key to unlocking that. Now, as I've argued, I hope, the separation of transport and housing policy has consequences. You get separate threads of policy development and lobbying from outside interests, and they will influence the way Whitehall and local government work. Now, in fairness, because somebody will make this point, there are spheres of public policy which are in the same Whitehall department, which are very much closer than housing and transport, most obviously health and social care. They're in a single department, only relatively recently, though they've been in the same department in the past and gone away and now come back. But because health is run by national government and social care by local government with completely different charging regimes, it proves almost impossible for successive governments, and it is now successive governments, to come up with a consistent policy for social care and the health for people who need social care. So I wouldn't want to be too naive in pretending that just by what I'm going to say in a moment, bolting these things together in a department or councils working differently, it will necessarily solve the problem, because it hasn't for health and social care. And there are other reasons for that, but it's worth noting it's the case. Now, as I said, the coming of Greater London, and indeed the new combined authorities, some with mayors, some not, has created an impetus to generate spatial strategies and plans which themselves do tend to bring housing and transport and indeed citywide planning together. And that is a step in the right direction, I would argue. But you've still got the issue that service interests and the need for places in the cabinet from time to time have forced them, where they were running as single departments in Whitehall, away again. And the other thing, of course, is that ministerial preoccupations matter. It's often easy to think, well, the cabinet's the cabinet, it's collective, well, it used to be collective responsibility, obviously. But you only have to look at George Osborne and the Northern Powerhouse and the resources that have been devoted, particularly to transport, but also to housing, to the northern region, because of an initiative which a particular chancellor believed in. to see how an individual minister can indeed make a difference. Now, policy making today. We've got Whitehall. We're a centralised country in England, and so Whitehall's very important. It controls a lot of money, particularly for capital investment in transport and in housing. So there is a duty, in my view, there for greater consistency in planning about delivery. New subnational institutions, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and London, combined authorities I've already mentioned, they do provide an opportunity to start to plan, even if resources and particularly planning decisions are not at the same level of government. So in London and the other combined authorities, transport is run at one level of government, the combined authority level, and the individual authorities run planning, which has a lot of influence on housing delivery. And of course in the rest of England, outside the city areas, you've got counties and districts, except where you've got unitary authorities, and there transport tends to be at one level, housing and planning at the other level of government. Now, I'm not saying we should necessarily reorganise local government, but some people will think that's something that should help in this regard. Now, very briefly, the session was about how better to align, split and unsplit the infinitive, these two spheres of public policy. Now, an obvious way to do it, and it has been tried, is the single department within Whitehall, with a powerful, interested minister and civil servants bearing down on the two topics for the kind of ends we'd all agree on. That's one possibility. Another one, number 10, the Cabinet Office. From time to time, there used to have been policy units that come and go, lots of machinery of government at the centre of government. Prime ministers try them, then they get rid of them, then new prime ministers try new ones. Some of that can help in coordinating government, but as I say, they do tend to come and go, those sort of centre of government institutional mechanisms. I think a hopeful and indeed beginning to be useful and successful ways to bring together housing, transport, planning at a city or county regional level. I think there are great opportunities at that level which are beginning to be explored more, and of course it would be possible significantly to devolve powers to the combined authority or local level. So, how to better align? Well, I think one thing it'd be good to consider is the transfer of, and I know these things are being reviewed elsewhere, more potentially all commuter rail lines to London and other combined authority type areas. I think that would be one thing it'd be worth thinking about. You can do the same with major roads actually within these same areas. You could create a London or combined authority type approach in all cities, or indeed in counties and groups of counties, that would allow a far greater level of devolution in a consistent way. That would help. Whitehall still has a lot of powers over money and indeed the delivery of the powers to do all of this. It could work to incentivise transport and housing working together more. And of course, as I've said, you could devolve funding to this level of government, this subnational level of government, with a requirement for broad alignment of transport and housing policy. So, coming towards the end of what I'm going to say, I think we can all agree, because of the complexity and the long evolved systems of government, the dense population of England, a whole range of other reasons, it's inconceivable that the market alone can deliver the kind of alignment we're discussing. It's just not going to happen. There's going to need to be public sector involvement and the legitimacy of elected institutions to have the authority to deliver certain kinds of policy consistency. I think there will also need to be a developed sense of how transport and housing policy alignment could produce benefits that the public will support and encourage. Because to get housing and transport up the list of this list from the beginning here of what the public's concerned about, it would be possible. Housing's gone up this list. Transport has been higher in the past, and in cities it is higher. Good news. So it would be possible to get the public on side for a greater alignment if they understood the benefits that might flow from that. And then lastly, what might such benefits be? Well, they're actually quite simple. Obviously, and most obviously, additional housing. Many parts of the country, not just London and the South East, there is a demand for additional housing. And that would be a major selling point, I think, for government and indeed local government in convincing that a greater alignment of resources and planning powers for transport and housing would benefit the public. I think a more thought through and described version of how these two services and public spheres of policy could deliver a better country would be an important step forward. And by the way, when all that's going on finally stops, should we all live so long, then there will be a need for a massive rethink of the way public policy works for everything else. Whatever Brexit meant, whatever the vote meant, whatever we all interpreted as meaning, we'll all interpret it differently. I doubt it can be read by anybody as let's just carry on not making any other policy and changing anything at all. It has to be changing some things. And that means better places. People like the place they live, but they can be better. And I think these kind of outcomes can be achieved by alignment within Whitehall. I do think that needs to be done. Doesn't necessarily mean a new department, but certainly consistency and alignment of policy in Whitehall, the subnational alignment of the relevant powers, and the devolution of resources where necessary to allow more consistent decision to be made. Now, that's not to say that there isn't a role for national government. There are some spheres of public policy and infrastructure investment, particularly for transport, where the projects are too big to imagine them not being done at the national level. But there are others where many more decisions could be made more locally, nearer where decisions are made about housing and planning, and I think that would be a massive potential benefit. So my final thought, and it's an optimistic thought, is that the public, when it has these kind of changes explained to them, will, I think, support what are common sense reforms that are easily explained to anybody who will listen. And in those terms, I think bringing together housing and transport would improve not only the lives of many people in the UK, but separately would be good for both sets of professionals who'd have even more interesting events, as I hope this evening will prove to you. Thank you very much.